daily podcast called Majority Report. Let's start with Marcos, and just tell us who you are, why you're here, and where you're from, and then if you want one fun fact about yourself. There you go.
All right, Sam. So, my name is Marcos Molitzis. I am the founder of Daily Coast, which is the nation's largest online liberal community of any kind, actually. And I'm here because we have a lot of work to do, so I haven't finished it. So that's why I'm here. And fun fact about myself, when I was in high school in suburban Chicago, I campaigned for Henry Hyde and still doing penance for my youthful indiscretions.
My name is Kyle Kulinski.
Kyle Driver!
He has legs.
Let me earn my applause. Thank you. I guess a fun fact is I drink a lot of seltzer, as many of you know. And yeah, I'm from New York, and that's pretty much it. New York. Hop into the issues.
Yeah. My name is Bakari Sellers. I am from Denmark, South Carolina, where we have 3 stoplights and a blinking light, so a very small town. Very happy to be here today. I was in the South Carolina State House of Representatives for nearly a decade. I ran for lieutenant governor in 2014, and the reason I'm here with you guys today is because I didn't win that race. One fun fact about myself is I went to law school because the LSAT is the only exam that doesn't have math. I'm terrified of math because I skipped 2 halves and a whole grade when I was coming up. So there we go.
Seltzer last night, and we drank seltzer together.
You guys are loads of fun.
Wow.
I'm Anna Caspari. Co-host and producer of the Young Turks, and also No Filter. Check it out. We're podcasting. And I'm here because we're going to have a great discussion among friends, among people who actually want to have a discussion, so I'm looking forward to that. And also, there's many fun facts. I guess I'm, the resident salty bitch on TYT. But more importantly, right now I feel like this chair is eating me alive. It's so big. I'm 5'3", so I can't sit back. But I'm looking forward to this conversation. Let's do it.
All right. Let me just start by addressing, forgive the pun, the elephant in the room. This is a panel asking the question, should we be socialists? There are no, to my knowledge, socialists on this panel. And I think to a certain extent, people up here are interested in some socialistic policies to some degree or another. For the sake of this panel, I think the idea of socialism is different both temporally through time and depending on who you speak to. But for the sake of this panel, socialism will mean the total democratic control of the means of production. Small d, not the Democratic Party, means of control of production. And I should just say, along the lines of my point about socialism changing, if you look at the Socialist Party platform from 1912, which a listener sent me, many of the proposals that were proposed at that time, we now see already implemented in the country, a 5-day work week, an 8-hour workday, no child labor, something along the lines of Social Security, minimum wage, freedom of the press was already there, but progressive income tax. And so what I'd like this panel to look at is, to what extent should we embrace socialistic policies, and to what extent, as those of us on the left, as within the context of electoral politics, we're a month away, less, from 2018 midterms, to what extent should we embrace the labels of socialism and the policies from an electoral standpoint? But what I'd also like to do now, starting with Anna, is just give us a sense, without justifying it, where you are on that spectrum from the left to the idea of total democratic control of the means of production, which would mean basically the major industries controlled by workers, essentially, or perhaps the state. So just give us a sense so that we get a sense of where everybody is on this spectrum.
Sure. I don't know exactly where I fall on that spectrum, but what I do know is that I'm a proponent of a mixed economy. So I do believe that there are certain programs that should be socialized, whereas other things should be left to private industry. So just to give you a quick example, quick rundown, our prison industry should not be privatized in any way. To imprison people, and that is precisely why we see this ridiculous drug war dragging on when it doesn't need to. I don't believe that the basic essentials for life, including healthcare, should be privatized. I think that we've kind of experienced the downfall of that. But at the same time, I also want to encourage innovation. I don't want the government to make my shoes, as Cenk uses an example of on a regular basis, Cenk Uygur, my colleague. And so, again, I think when it comes to the essentials of life, I want to see the government play a huge role.
Yeah, my views are similar. I think that prisons, of course, education, healthcare, we don't need profit there, and in fact, I think people are better served when the profit motive is removed. But I am really a true social democrat, where I do think that there are certain elements of society where a mixed economy is best. Now that being said, if you ask me, am I more comfortable with social democracy and the left being pulled by socialist ideas than fascist or cartoonish libertarian ideas? I say no. Let's engage with the socialist ideas and then figure out where to meet, rather than with some of those other ideologies.
So for me, having actually served and been an elected official, I find myself someone who understands and believes that government should play a role when we're promoting equality and fairness and justice, right? And just like you, and I think everyone on this panel, there is no role for a for-profit prison system, absolutely none, right? But there are, for example, coming from the poor rural South, there are roles for private industry to play. There are roles for private industry to come and supplement what government is not doing well. For example, in our public school systems in the South, many times we don't have the opportunities. One of the things I voted for, which I'm very proud of, was what some people would call corporate welfare, but it was a $750 million package. We probably could have spent it elsewhere, but to bring Boeing to South Carolina. Why was that important? Because in the South, you can't improve your schools unless you bring in industry, but you can't bring industry in unless you improve your schools. And so here we are attempting to kind of find that balance. But government should play a role when we're talking about equality, when we're talking about fairness, when we're talking about justice.
So I would say I'm largely in agreement with what Anna said and what David said. My personal politics are more social democratic than anything else. But at the same time, I think that what needs to happen in this country is we need to shift the Overton window way back to the left. Because as of right now, that Overton window is pretty far right, where you have Democratic politicians like Joe Manchin, for example. He votes with Trump 61% of the time. That's an actual number. That's, from 538, they track everything in the age of Trump, how often you vote with Trump. So when you have a Democratic politician voting with Trump 61% of the time, and you have the so-called moderate Republicans who vote with the Republicans 89% of the time, 90% of the time, it's a rigged game. So even though I personally don't believe in the social ownership of all of the means of production, I think there's actually a space for that in the conversation where people can drag that over to the window back to the left, because I think the only way you actually get social democratic reform is if you have actual socialists in the conversation, because you're going to find that middle ground. You're going to find that, that's the compromise point. And I want the compromise point to be Medicare for all, free college, living wage, ending the wars, a New Deal, legalizing marijuana, ending the drug war. And I really think that, thank you, one guy. The only way to get to that point is to have people who are to the left of Bernie Sanders and myself and most of the people on this stage to drag that spectrum back to the left.
It sounds like we're pretty much in agreement. on most points. So I would actually take a little, as opposed to the specific policies, I actually step back. I'm actually a capitalist. I'm a very proud capitalist.
That's the capitalist section.
That's the mega section.
But here's the thing, this is where conservatives get things wrong, is that they're obsessed with freedom, because the government's taking away our freedom, without realizing that corporations are actually almost sometimes the bigger culprits in taking away our freedoms, whether it's our freedom to clean air, or it's freedom to we have trillion-dollar corporations. You need government to provide a check to protect our individual liberties from the encroachment, from that capitalism that I otherwise absolutely love.
Can I add on that first thing?
Sure, Colonel.
Okay. I really like that point, because I think that the left can actually use that framing and that language to our advantage, because oftentimes people say about the left, oh, you guys just believe in big government, when in reality it depends what the question is, it depends what the issue is. So I actually want much smaller government when it comes to the NSA, for example, who's doing warrantless spying on everybody. I want much smaller government when it comes to the drug war and the fact that we have people locked up when they really shouldn't be locked up. So I think it's very, and even when it comes to something like abortion, most people on the left would say, I want the government more out than in, although you could have some regulations. So I feel like we can take that framing of freedom and we can use it to our advantage, and the left never does that. They just cede the ground to the right and let them define, what is and isn't freedom, and they get to pretend like they're the only ones for freedom, when I would argue it's actually the opposite.
All right, so, Bakari, let's start with you, because I think to a certain extent, from your perspective as someone who has run for office, to what extent should there be socialistic messaging? Like how much, it's certainly, Marcus and I have been, talking for 15 years at a time where coming out, using the word liberal was completely derided by the right. People would run from the word liberal on the left because of their fear of being labeled such from the right. Now, to the extent that there's any hesitation in using the word liberal, it is because concerns from the left on some level, at least within the context, I think, of online and the arena that a lot of us deal with. But from your perspective, from a messaging standpoint, right, I'm curious how broadly, from a national standpoint, but also sort of regionally, where do you think that messaging is?
So I actually think it's vastly different, because I think that individuals have to run their own races in their particular states, right? You have to run your own races wherever you are, whether or not it's school board or your local elected office. You have to be able to fit the community that you're running in. That's first, because in order to get to these values and policy points that we want, you have to be elected. So I differ slightly, because I think
Bad move.
I differ slightly about I differ slightly about Joe Manchin, for example, right? Because for me, it's a practical reality that if I want a Supreme Court justice, I have to have 51 United States senators, correct? And for me to get 51 United States senators, I have to be a party of not just Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, but I also have to be a party of Doug Jones and Joe Manchin. right? And for me, that's a very practical reality because we just went through an entire, because if for example, when Joe Manchin leaves the United States Senate, you're not going to have anyone there who espouses your beliefs or my beliefs or anyone's beliefs closer
I don't agree with that.
to win in West Virginia.
I think
and that's
we
just,
win on
but
our values.
you're not in West
He
Virginia.
voted for Kavanaugh. He voted for Kavanaugh.
My only point about that is that yes, he voted for Kavanaugh. My only point of that is that the reason that we have a Kavanaugh, the reason that we do not have a Justice Merrick Garland is because we do not have the majority in the United States Senate.
Because
And
we
so
don't
my
fight. If we fight, we'll get a majority.
The problem with that is that, yes, that sounds amazing.
Because it's right.
Well, let me just ask this. I mean, I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but what would be the primary data point that you would use, Kyle, to say that in West Virginia, for instance?
There's not
okay,
one.
Well,
That's
I
not
want to
true.
give you the opportunity.
In fact, this gentleman right here just said it. Richard Ojeda is that Donald Trump won by 49 points. There's now a Democrat leading by 5 points. And the reason is populism. Because he said, I'm going to fight and I'm not going to back down and I'm going to tell people.
Did he win?
No,
That's what I'm saying. That's not a data point.
November. Closed a giant gap.
That's not a data point.
Well, we haven't had an election since the last election.
So the argument is that based on the polling in a district in West Virginia,
Not just that, I have more. So also the fact that the Democrats lost 1,000 seats under Barack Obama's ideology, Nancy Pelosi's ideology, Chuck Schumer's ideology. This idea give the moderates their chance. You've had it for the past 40 years and now we have Donald Trump.
Do you say that Joe Manchin is just a necessary evil and we can see like Democrats just, it's not even worth it?
No, I'm
Well,
saying,
what's the
no.
strategy?
The strategy is that the tent is big. The strategy is that these litmus tests. The strategy is that litmus tests suck, right? And that's fine. But I'm going to finish the sentence. The strategy is that litmus tests suck. And the reason that they suck is that because if you were to have a litmus test, you would not have a United States senator that's a Democrat from Alabama, correct? You would not have a Stacey Abrams. You would not have an Andrew Gillum. You would not have these individuals who are able to be progressive for their particular state and manage their own values. If we want to have a litmus test, then you can have a litmus test all you want. However, you will not be able to effectuate the change that we want to be on the stage.
Can I jump in on that
yeah,
just for
Anna, I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but Anna, go ahead.
So I agree with you in that oftentimes litmus tests are not productive. And so I think that the important thing to focus on is not left versus right, but more importantly, the issues that both sides seem to care a lot about. And those are the populist issues. So let me give you an example. When Donald Trump was running, one of the things that he said over and over again was that he was going to protect Medicare, that he did not want to cut Medicare. Now that we've passed these insane tax cuts for the wealthy, there's talk about cutting Medicare, and that is not a popular thing to do. In fact, Mitch McConnell just had an interview where he admitted we're going to have to cut these very popular programs. Politicians don't want to do it because it's popular. That is not a right versus left issue.
Right.
That is a populist issue. So I think the issue that we're having with some of the more moderate Democrats is not that they're trying to cater to their constituents, but that they concede too much on issues that are extremely popular with their constituents.
Marcos, so then I just want to jump in this in a second, but go ahead, Marcos.
Yeah, no, there has to be a certain level of practicality. Speaking of Manchin, he actually signaled he would have voted against Kavanaugh had we gotten Collins. He wasn't going to cast the vote that was going to cost him at home to lose anyway.
No, I think that's obvious. I mean, frankly, there's a reason why
But he votes with Trump 61% of the time.
It's fine. You know, the Republican that would replace him will vote with Trump 100%.
But we can have Richard Ojeda, a Democrat, who can...
And
Well, wait a
Congress,
second,
he's
wait a
100%.
second. Kyle,
I understand that, but I'm saying that philosophy...
Kyle. Look, we've had a test because Joe Manchin had a primary challenge. And within the Democratic Party, that challenged her was from the left,
That's right.
and she lost. Now,
God,
Joe
and
Manchin,
she's a great candidate too.
yes,
She should run
no,
again.
and listen, Joe Manchin, I don't think there's anybody in this room who wouldn't say is anything other than a corporatist and a crony, and I think it's quite possible that in terms of like sheer ideology on this panel, we got to separate it.
To the left of Joe
We have to separate it. I think it's important, for this, at least for the sake of this conversation. Ideology from tactics and messaging.
I agree with that.
Because I will tell you, I will go further than anybody on this panel in terms of what I would nationalize. That said, there would be no privately owned power generation in this country if it was up to me. But that doesn't mean that 65% isn't better than 85% or 90% in terms of voting. And it's quite possible that your theory is correct. It just hasn't borne itself out. I mean, we can agree on that. Even within the Democratic Party in West Virginia, the challenge from the left failed.
And can I just make just a statement from because I understand that I am probably outside of you, Marcos, probably one of the more moderate people on this panel, right?
And we should say, you walk out in the hallway, you're considerably to the left.
Yeah, and that's fine. I mean, politics, it moves in sways. But this is when we talk about messaging, just from a pure messaging perspective, when you make swipes that were based on ideology at someone like Barack Obama, for example, right? That is when there is a large population in this country that then says that we don't want to hear the rest of the message, right? And so, that was just to your point when you were talking about the politics of Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama, and that's the reason we have Donald Trump. And I understand what you're saying, but from a messaging perspective, I mean, if you want to have issues with whatever the policy is, that's fine. But it's very hard for people to, once that swipe is levied, it's very hard for people to want to listen to the rest of the message. That's all I'm saying.
I'm not sure there's a data point for that one either.
But there is. His name is, there is.
Can I jump in for a second?
That's exactly
Yeah.
right. I think
Jump in
you
for a
can
second.
criticize policy.
So the thing that I'm concerned about is I don't want to ultimately be defeatist for left-wing populist goals that are overwhelmingly popular. I want people to acknowledge and recognize that a lot of these left ideas are actually really popular, and oftentimes we just kind of run away from them and act like, well, obviously the right is correct in their framing, and we need to pretend like we're not for Medicare for all because we don't want to lose an election. But the reality is, when you look at the polling data, 70% of the American people are for Medicare for all. Right now, even 52% of Republicans are for Medicare for all.
It's not the Democratic Party, it seems now, I would say, the average Democrat running for Congress, I think, has embraced, at least nominally, Medicare for all.
But let's say Joe Manchin, for example, just to keep using his example. Let's say he came out tomorrow for Medicare for all. Now, you guys tell me
he would consider it.
Okay, but so let's say he actually gives a hard yes on it. Do you think that would hurt him or help him in West Virginia? Do you think it would help him? Okay, so we agree. So what's the debate?
Well, no, but that's the point.
I'm saying it's good, not just good policy, it's also good politics, and to embrace left-wing ideas.
And I'm just saying that Joe Manchin's going to do the politics necessary for there to be a Joe Manchin.
Well,
but the difference between 50 and 49 is exponential when we're talking about the policies that all of us up here are advocating for. The difference between 50 United States senators and 49 United States senators is huge. And so my only point is that whatever politics locally Joe Manchin has to do to come back, we need Joe Manchin right there because we need that D from West Virginia.
Let's move forward. Let me start with Mark.
And I don't know how I ended up being a champion for Joe
but if we want to move towards a more socialistic policies, why focus on the Joe Manchins as opposed to, let's say, the Chuck Schumers? And I don't mean just like the leaders, but you have a reliably safe blue state. should there be, and there's two things to separate here with Chuck Schumer. One is the argument, he doesn't do politics very well, based upon what we've seen in terms of the past 30 Republican judges who just skated through. Chuck Grassley pulled sort of a fast one on him. Versus the question of, like, is he, for someone who's running in a blue state, sufficiently to the left to pull that Overton window or the center of the Democratic Party to the left? Marcos, what's your take?
Reliably blue state just gave us Andrew Cuomo again. So I mean, it's there are problems in organizing and building that support for those primary challengers, and I love primaries. I think that's where we fight these battles, not the general election. Once Joe Manchin has a nomination, we're fucked. Like, all right, we got to roll with the guy. So let's fight that in the primaries.
Can I just jump in really quick?
Yeah, please.
So I think that there are so many other factors that come into play that we're discounting while we're having this conversation. So, for instance, you have to keep in mind that one of the most important factors in being a competitor in politics is name recognition and media attention. And it's incredible the type of blockade that new candidates have to deal with when it comes to the media, getting the word out about what they advocate for, what they stand for, what they're running on. So that was an issue that Justice Democrats, for instance, ran into when it came to several the media had no interest in covering anything that was going on. The media ignored Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez until she won. Secondly, the issue that I think a lot of people are having on the left isn't just the fact that there are too many concessions to the right, but it's the fact that they cower to the right on issues that are tremendously popular. They're issues that are popular in their own districts. And then the final thing is, when it comes to the Chuck Schumers of the world, look, they get elected promising all sorts of left-wing policies. But at the end of the day, once they start taking that corporate money, they change their tune real quick. And so what we need when it comes to litmus tests, the only litmus test that I would argue is incredibly important and everyone should pay attention to is whether or not these candidates are taking corporate PAC money.
I'm not a big proponent of unilateral disarmament, though, right? But I think, for example, a perfect example of this is I think that Citizens United is like one of the worst things to ever happen to the United States of America. Just undoubtedly. It just corrupted our politics to a point where it's unimaginable. However, we were talking about good candidates winning races, right? And good candidates being able to achieve that level of media attention, and good candidates being able to win in those primaries. When I say I'm not a fan of unilateral disarmament, I don't want to take away resources from them, right? I want to make sure that Bernie did it. I heard somebody echo that. Bernie did it, correct. But we can count on one hand or two hands how many candidates have been able to actually do that. And so my whole thing is that we six of us up here, I tell you we don't do math well. All six of us up here are advocating for very similar positions on the left. And I think the only difference we have on stage is I want to actually make sure that individuals get elected to implement that change. And it's not just the platform that people are running on. I want them to have the resources necessary to actually get to the finish line and win, because then they can implement the platform.
Well, I think the argument is that that platform that we're talking about is inhibited by taking that money. And that is, I think, there's sort of there are, AOC won in a blue district with 25,000 votes, right? And that is very hard to replicate across the country, but it's obviously possible in certain areas.
Correct.
And they build upon, these successes. Let me ask this, Kyle, I know you want to jump in.
I got one fact I got to drop on everybody first, because it directly relates to this. So there was a great article in The Intercept that came out last week. There are 4 congresspeople right now who don't take corporate PAC money. After the next election, there's going to be over 40. Because of, honestly, unapologetic activists on the ground, on the left, saying we're not going to take your BS anymore, that's what's moving the party. And I think this shows that you can win. Because I understand your point about unilateral disarmament. I would just argue that I don't think it actually is unilateral disarmament, because it's such a powerful message. When you tell the people, I'm not taking corporate PAC money, and I'm going to represent all of you in this room, they donate small dollar donations.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I am saying, though, that if you are in a poor rural area, right, and you're running against somebody who's been established and been there for 20 years, right, and is taking money from Advance America, name all the bad actors that you could possibly name, right, from payday lending to private prisons, et cetera, and you're in this poor area, and yes, you tell your constituency that. You tell them that. You have these grassroots activists that believe in that, right? And people are giving you all they have. I'm just telling you that there are certain parts in this country where all they have will still not be enough to match resources.
Well, it's also,
Progressive media needs to come in and help in that situation.
we're also living in a fairly energized time. I mean, Russ Feingold did not take corporate PAC money.
Yeah.
And if there was ever a poster senator for not taking corporate PAC money, it was Russ Feingold of Feingold-McCain. So it's not a silver bullet, but I think there's clearly
nothing's a silver bullet.
Right, exactly. And I think that's. But go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so I would have agreed with you until third quarter, fundraising quarter this year, because the way there's very few Republicans that have outspent Democratic opponents, even in safe Republican districts this year. The flood of money right now, ActBlue is over what, 12, $15 million a day right
they've
now.
been blowing it out of
That's
water.
flowing into House and Senate races.
So the idea is, it is definitely possible. The fact that 40 members of the House theoretically could be in Congress, come November or January, who are not taking PAC money. We see this ActBlue money, where it's going to state Senate races as well as Beto O'Rourke raising such an enormous amount of money. And hopefully it's both sustainable and not matched, because Beto O'Rourke, we don't know what he's going to do. So, but Beto O'Rourke theoretically could become a senator from Texas, and not only be concerned, the issue is not just how he raised money to get that seat, but how his opponent 6 years from now, how much money they're going to have, and how much money is going to be spent during that time on attack ads against them. Because you can talk to any senator who will tell you there's two aspects to this, right? It's not just the money that's spent during the elections. It is the money that's spent during the legislative period in terms of lobbying, and the threat that someone will walk into your office and say, guess what? We're going to dump $10 million against you. And there's nothing you can do about that. And so this gets back to that balance. And I think in practice, there may have to be a balance, but I think Kyle's point that, that you need Joe Manchin to vote that 40%, to vote that 40% of the time, so that Merrick Garland gets in and may reverse Citizens United, whereas Brett Kavanaugh is never going to do that.
Well, so here's my question, Kyle.
Yeah.
And I asked this, I just want to be curious your thought on it. If in the short term, Joe Manchin is primaried and he loses, and then the person who defeats him in the primary loses, and Manchin's replaced with a Republican,
That's obviously worse.
It is worse.
Well, yes, because numbers are numbers. If Joe Manchin votes with Trump 61% of the time, but a Republican votes with Trump 100% of the time, no, I understand. I never said anything that contradicted that, so I don't know why that's like.
Because we won small victories.
My whole point, though, is that's obviously a fact. But I think that the more a Democratic politician represents the people and democratic values, the more likely they are to get elected, even in red districts, despite everything you've been told, because I honestly think it's largely propaganda, this idea that the right
everyone of that notion that that's propaganda? Can I disavow everyone of that notion from somebody who ran in 2010, somebody who ran in 2014? That is not propaganda. So these races that people are running, the race that Doug Jones ran in Alabama was a very hyper-local race that focused on Alabama issues. And yes, Doug Jones...
He was against the pedophiles.
That actually makes my point, right? Because that's how, and he still barely won. He won because of Selma when it came in late in the middle of the night. And so that's actually my point, is that these things are very, very difficult. That's why, again, to piggyback on what you were saying, how litmus tests, and you actually gave a good litmus test, are not appropriate, because we have to have people who fit their districts. And I think that is that is important first and foremost.
But does that mean that sometimes you have to just take a Joe Manchin and that's it?
Well, but the point is that none of us live in West Virginia. Like, so I'm curious, in terms of like the litmus tests we're talking about, are largely irrelevant in the sense that, like, okay, I mean, there's nothing. I could have we could all have a litmus test as to what the senator from West Virginia should have, but there's really nothing that we can do about it beyond what I think, to a large extent, we all agree on, is like primary that guy or woman, and we're going.
There is something else. It actually goes back to the original question about Chuck Schumer. Once we have power, then we have the ability to set an agenda, and then we can put pressure on the caucus to actually govern.
Because that's where I am. I'm for getting rid. So my only point about the Democratic Party, and I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just, like, there was a time not too long ago when Democrats did have power. They had power in Congress, they had power in the executive branch, and we got pretty much nothing.
Yeah,
What makes me the most jealous of the Republican Party is how they fight.
Yes.
They fight so aggressively, they'll get anything done. They'll get someone like Kavanaugh confirmed in the Supreme Court. And we're not talking about Kavanaugh
But
anymore.
that's-
it's not in the headlines, so we're talking about it anymore. When Obama got elected, pretty much everyone in the country, people who now have voted for Trump, were on his side.
Yes.
Right? People wanted change, and we kept getting 5% change. We kept getting incremental change. And people are fed up with it. I mean, the Affordable Care Act, Republicans have already dismantled it. They took the
They
mandate
have
away.
not dismantled it.
Taking the mandate away,
They have not dismantled it, though. There are millions of people in this country, because of Medicaid expansion that you get from the Affordable Care Act, that now have health insurance. You have Lilly Ledbetter, which was passed in his first 100 days.
True.
You have
That's all stuff that
you have
can
Supreme
easily be
Court justice.
undone by the Republican
You
Party.
have Supreme Court. So let's not, this whole poo-pooing on the legacy of an individual, they had a majority for 2 years. They had a majority for 2 years.
That's
In the
right.
House and Senate.
Long time to get some stuff done.
And in the House and Senate, you actually have the Affordable Care Act. You have people who are now covered. Did you know that C-sections were not covered by Blue Cross and Blue Shield because they deemed that to be a pre-existing condition. So to say that incremental change is bullshit is a bullshit concept.
Hold on.
I need to make sure my point is not
Let me just make a
characterized.
last point on this, because this is a different panel. No, I do think it's relevant. But
Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, just let me be absolutely clear about what I mean when I say incremental change. The Affordable Care Act, no doubt, did accomplish incredibly important things. I'm not trying to minimize that. However, there are still 28 million Americans who are uninsured. We're dealing with unaffordable premiums. We're dealing with unaffordable deductibles. I should know, as someone who has good insurance but still had to pay $3,000 out of pocket for my husband's shoulder surgery. We could have accomplished more. That's what I'm saying. Once Republicans have control, you see what they do in a short period of time because they fight.
Yes.
I think it is, we're at an era though where the Democrats are now at Medicare for all. And I think it's very hard to present a counterfactual that without the ACA we would be at this point or not. It's very difficult to sort of make that assessment.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
Now, I can tell you as someone who, I think my disdain for Joe Lieberman is unrivaled, but perhaps anybody breathing air today. And Joe Lieberman was not going to go that much further. I think there is an argument that the Democrats could be more aggressive on doing this stuff for reconciliation and whatnot, but the durability of the ACA, and I think the ACA part was oversold, the patient protections, like we're talking about pre-existing conditions, are durable enough that you have Republicans who are running on those achievements as protected.
As they're simultaneously doing a lawsuit to try to take them away, which is important.
Exactly, which is problematic for them. Because you have, like I say, almost every Democrat running for Congress in the country, maybe 80%, is running on that very thing right now. And so, from a political standpoint, I think there's two things that happen. One, that we had that baseline that was moved up a little bit. And we had other groups that have come in and reacting against the lack of aggressiveness that are filling that. I mean, groups like Justice Democrats, like the DSA, are filling that vacuum and are driving a lot of this. All right,
Can I jump in real quick?
Quickly, and then we got to go to questions.
Okay, so the Democrats did have a supermajority under Obama, and
For 18 months, I got to
okay, but they still had a supermajority. And the point is, they could have, if they really wanted to. If I was Barack Obama, I would have called every single Democratic senator, every blue dog Democrat into my office and told them straight up, listen, if you don't vote for a Medicare for all bill, I'm sorry, but we're going to come and get you with everything we have. We're going to try
There's absolutely nothing about that that's rooted in any type of political reality.
Why?
Well, they all those blue dogs lost in 2014 anyway.
So Tom Perriello is the best example of this.
Well, but all those blue dogs lost in 2010 anyway.
But they could have gotten Medicare for all, the point, if you put enough pressure on them.
But that also presumes that Barack Obama
Wanted, which he didn't, which is another one of my main points, which is, you know, when you take corporate money, oftentimes you end up being against the will of the people.
I don't think Barack Obama's taking corporate money made him decide on that. I think
the
it was
Democratic
his
Party takes
disposition.
money from for-profit health
Of
insurance
course,
companies. So they're not going to go against the for-profit health insurance companies until we force them to.
I agree with that as well. But how do we force them to is...
By having litmus tests, which we were just poo-pooing before.
Well, no. There's no evidence that that's the case.
Then what's the case?
That politicians who lose, that there is a central Politburo that is pulling the levers of all these Democratic politicians, as opposed to them all acting in their own interests or out of their own cowardice or whatever it is. There's no one entity that controls these people. So there's no lesson.
Lobbyists are pretty.
There's no lesson for the Democrats to learn, because if a politician loses, they don't go back and run again as a different politician. If you can show me an example.
But can I mention while
I know we got to go.
I know, but I mean, this has been said a lot about corporate interest and all of this other stuff as it relates to Barack Obama. But I want everyone to understand that the largest gains we've made when it came to criminal justice reform wasn't Barack Obama, okay? And let's not act like that didn't happen over here. And not only that, but I mean, the ban, as we talked about for-profit prisons, the ban of the DOJ actually doing business and contracting with for-profit prisons actually happened under Loretta Lynch and Barack Obama.
This would have been a good panel to do the legacy of Obama. And I think there's some relevance to it, but I think, a lot of what we see here is a function of frustration on some level, justified or not, but we got to go to questions. 15 minutes. So.
We're
All right,
not going to fit all of these.
For the sake of as many questions as possible, question, 2 sentences, don't need the premise of your thought, just honestly, the question will start on this side.
So this is a question for everyone. In order to taught the country from the right to the left, in order to taught the country from the right to the left, what do you think? How do you think Democrats should respond to the procedural warfare that's been waged on them for the past several decades.
Yeah, no, that's one of the biggest criticisms I have of the Democratic Party is that we continuously disarm unilaterally on the procedural front. I mean, the blue slip for judges was the thing that Bush got rid of, and then when Republicans took over Congress, and then when the Democrats took it in 2006, and he brought it back. Basically, say, here, Republicans, here's a tool for you to obstruct.
Coons has floated the idea of bringing back the filibuster. If the Democrats get back.
I know, that's insane.
Sure.
The only person who actually played the game very well was Harry Reid. I mean, Harry Reid was as cutthroat as they were when it came. We're talking about procedurally.
Right.
And there's nobody who put the Senate in knots and was able to push through things like Harry Reid at the time.
Except he removed Lion Harry Reid.
Gus.
Hello, my name's Tomas. My question is, you call for socialist policies within our democratic republic and denounce centralized power of multinational corporations. How is an increase in clunky governance and socialist policies going to protect the average American when the commonality between big government and big corporations is that big equals bad?
I'll answer that question. You, or at least 2/3 of this room, if we are a general view of population, would be living in poverty in our retirement were it not for Social Security. The most socialist.
I am richer than most of the world. I do not live in poverty.
You would be.
Well, listen.
You would be.
You also have. You also have. I know that you may be richer than the rest of the world. I'm talking about in America.
Yeah, I am.
When Social Security was, you are not 2/3 of the population. You're an individual.
Bro, my last name is Morales. My dad was a drug addict. I am, and I still.
So you benefit from social
No,
programs.
I don't benefit from social programs. I benefit from working. I benefit from wanting to create,
And you have social insurance that in the event something horrible happens to you or to the little Moraleses or your Mrs. Morales, or she get their own name, when you get to be a senior, you have insurance that in the event some tragedy happens, you will still not live in poverty.
Can I also add to that for a little bit? So oftentimes when we talk about the
Get the
government's
next
role in these social programs, we talk about the Social Security, the Medicare, all of that. But one thing that people don't know much about, because it doesn't get talked about, is the entrepreneurial state. How much money our federal government invests in private companies, private corporations. So just to give you one quick example of that, our federal government actually gave Elon Musk $5 billion in the development of his businesses, right? So these private corporations, many of them wouldn't even be around if it wasn't for taxpayers.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Naya Shamir, and I have a question regarding money in politics. You were stating that you don't want to remove any options, but by removing corporate,
So me.
no. By removing money from the elections, wouldn't that level the playing field and not make these huge amounts of money that's being invested in?
We're saying the same thing. I'm a huge proponent. I think that, but you can't. My only point is that we can't get to a point where you would overrule the Citizens United, for example, or anything like that, until you actually have the votes that matter to appoint Supreme Court justice.
Let's get a constitutional amendment to get money out of politics.
All of these.
I have a response. The 28th Amendment with Wolfpack.
If we wanted a 28th Amendment, or if we wanted to supplement, first of all, I'm not a big fan of opening up the Constitution. That's a slippery slope for me, but.
It's been done many times.
That's okay.
Called amendment.
My brother in the back was like, yeah, we're not letting y'all play with the Constitution. I would make sure that access to a first-class education and quality health care would be the two things that
I agree with that,
I would amend
yes.
the Constitution before.
Get the right to vote. Get the right to vote, too.
Yeah, well, we tried. We just got it.
Hi, Saeed Gonzalez. I was wondering how we could bring the attention, using the argument of socialism, against the incremental change that we all hate, including me, especially when we saw how horribly the Democrats botched up their chances to upgrade DACA. Being a DACA recipient myself, is there a way to bring attention through to issues like that using socialism?
Wait, why are the Democrats at fault for DACA when it was Republicans in charge?
Really?
Pardon? Yeah, the Democrats didn't fight.
They
The
didn't
Democrats.
fight it, is what you're saying?
No. They didn't fight for it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, they did.
No, they didn't. Chuck Schumer took a promise from Mitch McFreakin-Connell.
Just like he did with the judges.
So he's referring to the issue of funding the government.
Correct.
At that time, Democrats could have fought back by refusing to vote to fund the government if Republicans didn't sign legislation protecting DACA recipients.
I think that we could have an extended debate on this, but that was tactically one of the stupidest things that Chuck Schumer could have possibly done. In December, with all kidding, this is getting very much in the weeds, but in December of 2017, the Republicans were looking at a nightmare of a December. And Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi walked in and said, we'll take a couple of things off the plate for you. And I think that was probably, I think, ultimately, again, Chuck Schumer having some type of problem with politics rather than ideological. But
let me, I'd like to answer that question, because actually, how do you talk about socialism in addressing that issue? Because it's actually, I think we as a party have evolved dramatically. Those of us who've been around for years know that we have to deal with Ben Nelson and Joe Lieberman and all those assholes. Now, next year, with the start of the 2020 presidential race, you're going to see the entire field, it's going to be about 20 people running. Price of admission to even be considered a candidate, it's going to be Medicare for all, it's going to be DACA, it's going to be
expansion of Social Security.
yeah. And it's fueled and helped by the Ocasio-Cortez's and those successes. So we are moving in a direction. Now, socialism is such a kind of buzzy word, and the right's going to accuse us of being that anyway, right? So all right, well, socialist, what the fuck do you think a socialist is? But I think Ocasio-Cortez is doing a good job in defining what that means to be a democratic socialist, and I think that's helpful. And I think the Democratic field is going to have to adopt that.
And
That's not just because she's Latina, right?
As we talk about messaging, because a lot of this is about messaging, it's kind of, the right has kind of dug themselves into a little hole when it comes to socialism, because for 8 years, every single day they woke up and were like, Barack Obama's a socialist, you're a socialist, you're a socialist.
And a Marxist, they went further.
And a fascist.
Everything at once.
Everything at once. I was like, I don't even know how this all makes sense. But what happened was we saw the stock market go from 6,000 to 20,000. We saw income levels rise among all demographic groups. We saw unemployment rate for all demographic groups cut in half. And so when people started branding him as a socialist, and then you saw this economy just grow and boom. Now people are like, wait a minute.
He's a moderate Republican.
But the bottom line, too, I think, is that we are far enough away from what people who grew up with the Cold War perceived. Socialism was just a dirty word, and we're further out from that. But
Founding father.
yes.
Hello, testing 1, 2, 3, yeah. I came to this meeting because it asked the question, should we be socialists in Independence Hall? It's kind of an interesting question. I got to see the fall of the Berlin Wall. I saw the impact of centralized planning, and I think you would advocate that Libby's test and centralized planning, but
No, I wouldn't frame it like
Not a
that.
single person here who's talked about a centralized
very
system.
well, it always ends up going that direction.
No, it
To make
doesn't.
No, let me answer that. Because you're talking
Let him
about,
ask the question.
you're talking
Put a question mark.
You're right, I should put it in a question.
just accuse us of being central planners. We should have.
Ultimately, because I believe socialism is the antithesis of our human nature. We are more local, and you're trying to do these globalized policies, national policies, and whatever you want. Locally, we have small businesses. It's, yes, if everybody's giving.
All right, can we just get a question?
Very good. So, Well, to answer the question, I don't think we should be socialists.
I can tell.
I don't think our founders would have liked it either. They set up a system to stop socialism. But show me how you would make this work.
Well, the answer is, I totally disagree with your framing. Your premise is wrong. So I don't know if you were here earlier, but what I said earlier is, on many issues, the left should talk more about freedom, because we actually are more in favor of freedom and independence. Ending the drug war, that means I want the government out of your life. When I talk about ending warrantless NSA spying, that means I want the government out of your life. And you like to, conservatives like to do this where they say, oh my God, Cuba, Soviet Union, bad things and stuff. Because everybody I've spoken to says social democracy like Sweden. And you just disregard that response, and that's why we get frustrated and why I seem mad.
Well, appreciate
There's a debate.
Yeah, no, sir? Okay. Last question right over here. Thank you.
So, my question is for the seltzer sellout. So, earlier we were talking about Joe Manchin and the impact that he has right now, and I remember Sam mentioned that Joe Lieberman and the disdain you had for him. So, if the Democrats were to retake both houses of Congress and the executive branch, let's say 2020, wouldn't Joe Manchin just become another Joe Lieberman, where he would be an obstructionist to our progressive progress?
Well, unless you play politics properly, which the Democrats don't. Like I was saying earlier in regards to Obama, if I was in Obama's position back when he had a supermajority, the amount of pressure I would have put on, not just the blue dog Democrats, but also the so-called moderate Republicans, I would have made their life a living hell unless they voted for my agenda. Because I'm here to fight for the American people. I don't care about anything else, so I'm going to fight for them as hard as I can.
The people of West Virginia. No, it's.
But
that's
the point. When he's not for clean water, he's wrong in that.
Joe Lieberman didn't really become like, you might have hated him for a long period of time, but he really went off the reservation after he was no longer a Democrat, when he was serving as a...
No. There was a reason why he was primary.
No, that was a reason why he was primary, but he absolutely went like obstructionist lunacy.
But
when you had an eye behind it.
Lieberman would go on Fox News. We had a term for it back in the day, the Fox News Democrats.
The Fox News
He would
Democrats.
go
Yeah.
on Fox to trash Democrats. Ben Nelson did it. Joe Manchin doesn't do that.
Yeah. Well, just because he doesn't say something, it doesn't.
Look,
I know, but
the idea is that Joe Manchin
his voting record is more
disciplined in terms of by the Democratic Party, and by the Democratic Party, I mean like what people are voting for and what people are polling on. And I think ultimately, as the party moves to the left, it's much easier to discipline a Joe Manchin once he's in office. Yes, Joe Manchin will definitely be somewhat problematic if the Democrats take over, but the idea is that you've got to have enough ballast so that Joe Manchin becomes irrelevant.
And I think when you think long term, my whole point can be summed down to this. In the long term, we can get a Richard Ojeda in Joe Manchin's seat. And
when we get to that point, I want to be at 5149 so that we can start. Once you don't need them. Once you don't need them.
But those two things are not at odds. But all right. So listen, we gotta end it here for 4:30. I don't know. Do we have like 60 seconds for each person if they want it? 60 seconds. Anna, do you want to start?
I'm going to give up my 60 seconds. I really want to get to a debate. So.
Okay.
Don't let the right confuse you about socialism versus social democracy. This is something they're doing now. There's very few actual socialist policies.
Just never be afraid to speak your truth to power, whatever that is. This debate is something that we don't often get, and so it's healthy. This is very healthy, and don't let anybody tell you it's not.
Where's everybody going? What are you doing?
Well, everybody's going to the debate, so it's good.
My final point, first of all, thanks everybody for coming out. I really appreciate it. It's awesome that you're on here. But to sum up my point, if you run on an anti-corruption message and you run on a populist message, you will win everywhere. Red district, blue district, purple district, doesn't matter.
Look at the being socialist, so let's read the define what that means and educate people on what democratic socialism is. And it's actually things that, as you mentioned earlier, hold really well. We're not out of the mainstream on these issues.
All right, folks, thanks for coming.